is going to be recorded. And with that, I would like to just provide us with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. UNA recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands, holding in high regard the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government. We are committed to supporting Native nations by serving and training the nonprofits that care for these peoples. And with that, I'd like to introduce our speakers today. So if you guys want to join us and go off mute, we have Todd Anderson, Jack Markman, and Kathy Rigby with us today. And I believe Jack is starting, right?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So Jack, I'll let you go ahead and take it away.
Sounds good. Let's see if I can get this up and running. Can you all see that? Perfect. Thank you for the introduction. Definitely happy to be here presenting at UNA. As was mentioned, my name is Jack Markman. I'm a community grant specialist with the Department of Community and Neighborhoods with Salt Lake City Corporation. And I'm going to be talking about the Community Recovery Assistance Grants Program. A little bit of a mouthful. Let's see if this will work. There we go. So just a brief program description. The Community Recovery Assistance Grants Program is a part of the larger ARPA-funded community grant program that was mentioned before. Economic development, and some of my colleagues in economic development, Todd and Kathy, will be presenting on that after me. Ours is named slightly different from theirs just because both of us serve nonprofits and we wanted to create some sort of simplification or a little bit of clarification between our two funding streams. I guess only time will tell if that's actually going to be helpful or more confusing, but if you have any questions, then we're CRAG funding, C-R-A-G, an interesting acronym. So our funding is provided to nonprofit organizations who require resources to address ongoing needs in the community in the wake of COVID-19. The operative words being ongoing needs and in the wake of COVID-19. This funding has been provided to us from the federal government and by the city as a way of augmenting some of the funding that many of you have already received to assist those segments of the population who need additional assistance recovering from the pandemic and from the results of it. These funds are meant to be provided as direct services to the community and provided in the municipal boundaries of Salt Lake City. I'll go over each one of those categories a little bit later, but hopefully that's just at the outset a little bit of a disclaimer that this is service-based funding and it is meant for those who are living in Salt Lake City. And then, as I already mentioned, this funding is separate from the Department of Economic Development, DED, ARPA Community Grant Program funding. We do a lot of work together. We're both funded by the same program and both of us serve nonprofits, but in the end, we're two separate funding streams and we have two separate applications. So something to keep in mind as we're going forward. As just an overview of program funding, our program is funded to the tune of $2 million of federal ARPA funding administered by our department, the Department of Community and Neighborhoods, or CAN. This is one-time funding that we have been awarded from the federal government and we will be spending over the next couple of years. For what that means for each one of you is a nonprofit organization could apply for a grant of up to $100,000. Now, I know in the past that in other grants, sometimes nonprofits will apply for multiple programs within their organization and put in multiple applications at once. You're also welcome to do that. So this isn't a cap for how much the nonprofit can apply for, just how much you can ask for in one specific application. Minimum requests are $30,000 and a preferred minimum request is $50,000. We include this second request just because of some Treasury guidelines that change the reporting requirements for funding under $50,000 and funding over $50,000. So if you're wondering whether or not you should ask for more or less, feel free to ask for more. We want to be able to provide these funds so that they can help those in your community. But at the end of the day, you know what your community's needs are better than we do and how you can spend this funding appropriately. So the $50,000 is a guideline, the $30,000 is a bottom floor requirement. And then just to highlight this little addendum at the bottom, funding is limited. Like I said, this is one-time funding that we've received, and we expect that we'll receive more applications than we can fund for this period and for over the length of the grant. Not all organizations are going to be funded, and not all of your funding requests will likely be met. The best way to, I wouldn't say ensure, but the best way to help see if your funding level is close to that what's requested is to provide good documentation to show what your community need is and how your program provides support to that need. So the better evidence you can give us of the need in the community and the way you meet that, the more likely you're to receive higher funding levels. Just to go over some of the eligibility requirements. First, funding eligibility requirements in broad strokes. This program is meant to fund principally low to moderate income households. That category could also be defined as area median income, or AMI, 40% for the low side and 65% for the moderate side. Those are HUD guidelines. You can look them up, or I could talk to any of you after if you have questions about that. But the funding for this grant is meant to serve principally populations below 65% AMI. It's also principally meant to be provided for direct services to the communities. We're definitely sensitive to the fact that households and individuals in the community aren't the only one who are struggling to recover from COVID. Many of your organizations may still be trying to find ways to do revenue replacement or wages or hiring or those sort of things. And we're definitely sensitive to that. But this grant is principally to provide direct services to your clients. It has some staffing elements that can help support those programs, which I will talk about a little bit later. But just wanted to highlight the importance of direct services. And then these two, hopefully they're a little bit straightforward. This funding is meant to serve households and individuals residing in the municipal boundaries of Salt Lake City. Funding was awarded to the city and it was approved and distributed by the City Council. And they would like to make sure that the funding is going to Salt Lake City residents. I can talk with any of you later if you have questions about this. And then it's only meant to cover costs incurred after March 3rd, 2021, with very few exceptions. You can ask me about those, but those exceptions don't really apply to the costs that your organization might be incurring. Eligibility requirements for you as an organization are also, I hope, pretty straightforward. You need to be registered as a 501c3 organization. You need to provide required documentation, which I'll highlight a little bit later in the slides. And your plan, your proposal, application for your program has to focus on equity-based services. Like we mentioned, this program is meant to serve those who are low to moderate income, those who have been most impacted by the pandemic and are still struggling to recover from the pandemic. So your program needs to be focusing on those sort of equity-based services, as I'm sure most of you already are. To highlight in a bit more detail what the funding can go towards, the Salt Lake City Council has established 6 activity categories that we are going to be funding as the areas of different types of programs that will be eligible for funding. These are retraining displaced workers, so job training, legal services for eviction assistance, expanded educational opportunities, resources to mitigate the digital divide, access to healthcare for underserved populations, and mental health assistance. Each one of these definitely has some flexibility in it. So your program might fall under one of these categories and have a slightly different focus than, meaning that there's just some latitude within them. But if your category doesn't fall in some way under one of these categories, then you may not be able to be funded under this program. There are also expenditure categories, which are a treasury requirement for reporting. I only include this section in here because I know it's going to be a point of confusion going forward. So I thought I would just give a heads up. Treasury has their own sort of activity categories that they require us to report when we are reporting how the funds have been spent. Those categories can be confusing because sometimes they're more general than the activity categories and sometimes they're more specific. There's a couple of examples below that don't neatly fit with any of the activity categories. I am going to be providing as much guidance as I can, and any questions that you might have in the application process about these two categories, I'm happy to help. If you take anything from the slide, though, the activity categories should be the primary thing you're focusing on. That's what your proposal and your application is going to be nesting and falling within. And then just additional eligible funding uses. I mentioned before that not all funding, though it has to be direct services, has to be in the form of direct client costs. So maybe if you're funding a case manager, that definitely qualifies as direct services, and we're happy for this funds to cover those costs as direct service staffing expenses. We're also willing to cover up to 20% of direct administrative expenses for the program, though we ask that you keep them under 20%. And then if you also wish to request indirect costs for your program, you can request the negotiated national NICRA rate if you want to have that on this program, or you can opt in to have the de minimis 10% indirect cost rate for your program. Okay, now to cover some of the documentation requirements in a bit more detail. Required documentation includes some straightforward things, I hope: tax documentation of your 501c3 status, workers' compensation compliance, liability insurance, and then, like I mentioned before, just documentation for your proposal, proof of current community need and your ability to provide support to that need. And then, depending on other factors in the application, you might have additional requirements. If you opt to have a NICRA indirect cost rate, we will require a NICRA certificate as a part of your application. You might require a financial audit. If you have one, you don't necessarily need to have had one, but if you do, we'd like that. There might be a few others. And then in addition to this, there'll be supplementary documentation, which I think might be a little misleading. This is not documentation that is optional necessarily, so much as documentation that is a bit more general and will vary depending on the program that's applying and the organization that's applying. So if you've received other federal or state COVID-19 fund awards, you may request documentation of those. If not in the application, then later on after award, just to ensure that there isn't any double dipping for certain expenses. We'll be requesting organization policies, procedures, and bylaws, as well as funding tracking system details, just to ensure that the funds can be managed appropriately. This is integrated into many of the questions of the application, but additional documentation may be requested as well. So this isn't necessarily optional documentation, just variable documentation, maybe a better way to describe it. Okay. A couple more details about the application and the timeline. Important dates that we know at this stage of the program going forward, and that would be important to remember. So the program application will be opening September 1st, and will be open for all of September for 30 days. Applications received after that deadline will not be accepted. I'm not even sure if you're able to apply after the deadline, as the applications are exclusively online. But that's the date. If you want to apply for funding, apply sometime in September. January 1st, 2023, we imagine, is the latest date that funding will be available. After your applications are processed, we'll have to review them. The City Community Recovery Committee will review them. There'll be scoring, awards, contracting. Each of those will take some time. We're not entirely sure by what date funds will be available. We're hoping later this year, but they'll be available no later than January 1st. And then all funds that are awarded need to be spent down by no later than December 31st, 2024. If for some reason you need an extension, we might be willing to offer those, but no later than this date. So any funds that you receive, if they're not spent by this date, will be lost. If you want additional details on this, as well as a link to the application when it's open, these applications are going to be strictly online and processed through Zoom Grants, which is our grant management software. You can find additional information about that, the software, and a link to apply on this link here that is so blending into the background. You can keep an eye on this link and on this webpage. We'll have the application up and running by September 1st, and additional details and dates as we learn them. Finally, I want to emphasize that we are committed as a department and the staff to be able to provide all the assistance we can to you as you're applying for this funding. We'll be providing informational webinars in both English and Spanish sometime during the application period. Again, check the website to find a better date for that. We're not sure what that date will be just yet for our specific program. So recordings of those will also be available, so you can go back and watch those and parse through some of these details, and these slides will be made available as well. If not here in UNA, then they'll be made available on the website. I'm always available to book one-on-one appointments. If you need assistance, you can come in person to City Hall and meet with me, or we can meet over the phone or over Zoom. I don't speak Spanish, but we have people in our office and people on our staff who do. So if you need assistance in Spanish, please request that, and we're happy to provide it. If you need assistance in any other language other than English and Spanish, also let us know, and we'll work with the Mayor's Office of Equity and Inclusion to find resources and translators to enable us to be able to have that conversation and provide those sort of services. So if you have any questions about any of these things in this presentation, my contact information is below. I'm happy to talk with anyone. And that's all I have. Thank you for having me here. I don't know, do we doing questions now or after economic development's presenting?
I just had one question that maybe you could answer real quickly.
Sure.
If you could provide clarification on opportunities that are available just within the Salt Lake City limits, or can that be opened up to those who are in Salt Lake County?
So I'm going to say at this juncture that we're going to be pretty insistent that the requirements remain in Salt Lake City, at least the initial proposals. I know that there have been programs in the past that we've had that were city funding where there's been some leverage. I can't really comment on whether that's going to be available, but for now, I'm going to insist that, or I'm going to say that the council is going to prefer, since these are federal dollars, that these remain within the city.
Okay. Thank you. All right, I think let's go ahead and transition to our other speakers, and then we can continue on with additional questions after they're done.
Excellent.
All right. Well, thanks, Jack. Appreciate that. I'll just introduce myself on my section of the presentation. So I'm Todd Anderson. I'm the ARPA project coordinator on the economic development side. And here with me is Kathy Rigby, the ARPA project manager. And so I'll share my screen here. Can you all see that? All right. So if, for some reason, you got through Jack's presentation, maybe your nonprofit doesn't apply for those specific things. There are these additional, a couple different ways that a nonprofit could apply if you don't apply or if you don't or aren't eligible for Jack's program. So we'll go through that now. On our side of the community grant program in economic development. So on our side, there's $2 million available in funding. And this funding is for small businesses, artists, artisans, creatives, and nonprofits as individual businesses. And they can apply for grants up to $50,000. And also nonprofit organizations that offer arts or small business specific COVID-19 recovery programming, and that can go up to $100,000. And the same rules apply that, funding will be limited. We're expecting we'll get a lot of applications that will be over, what can be funded. So I'll go into a little bit on the two different ways that you can apply in this way if you're a nonprofit. One, we know that, nonprofits are businesses themselves, and a lot of them were negatively impacted by COVID-19. by shutdowns that happened throughout 2020 and 2021. So if you, you as a nonprofit can apply, as yourself to basically help with economic recovery. At the eligibility requirements, that you need to be physically located and licensed to do business in Salt Lake City before January 1st, 2020. You need to have less than 50 full-time employees, and you need to show you were negatively impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic or related shutdowns. And we'll go in later slides on how exactly you can show that and give proof of that. The second way you can apply is basically as a subrecipient applicant or a pass-through of funding. This is for nonprofits. If you currently work with arts and culture, community, or small businesses, or even if you have a future idea of how you could specifically help these populations with their COVID-19 recovery, you can apply as a subrecipient applicant. To be eligible for this, you need to be a 501c3, 501c4, 501c6, or 501c19. So that adds things like Chamber of Commerce's, business alliances, veterans organizations. So it'll be one of those four. It'll the requirements that you offer programming for arts or small business for COVID recovery. And you need to specifically target artists, artisans, or small businesses operating within Salt Lake City. And then we ask that if you serve a disproportionately impacted community, such as historically marginalized communities, female-owned businesses, to put that in your application. So disproportionately impacted businesses and industries. So if you are a nonprofit and you're applying for yourself, you can show that you are a disproportionately impacted business or an impacted industry. And you can use grant funding in additional ways that we'll go through in a couple of different slides. So if you're operating in a qualified census tract, there's a map to the left here, but also there's a link that these are, federal areas that are deemed, more impacted. So if you're in that area, you can use your funding in additional ways. If you're a 100% women-owned nonprofit, 100% minority-owned, or an arts and culture, these are right now they're pending to be disproportionately impacted, but we're hoping that also gets added as a criteria that, if you were in one of those three areas, you can use funding in additional ways. Also impacted industries, businesses in the travel, tourism, or hospitality sectors, or if your business is in the downtown city center between North Temple and 400 South and between 200 East and I-15. Again, that one is pending. This doesn't mean if you aren't in one of these categories that you can't apply. This just means that you can use your funding in additional ways, and we'll kind of go through that in the next slide. So what you can use the grant funds for. If you're applying for yourself as a nonprofit, you can use it for wages, payroll, and benefits, costs to retain employees, mortgage, rent, utilities costs, COVID-19 prevention procedures such as barriers, dividers, vaccines, testing, one-on-one business counseling, or other operating costs such as inventory costs or supply chain management. And then these below here are the additional ways that you could use funding if you're a disproportionately impacted business. A business incubator, you can use it for startup or expansion costs, childcare support, transit support, and capital investments. Those do have restrictions, but you can go on our website to see a lot more detail if you'd want to use the funding for capital investment. If you're applying as a subrecipient applicant, there's a kind of a lot less rules here, but it's really just to provide an effective and efficient program designed to respond to a negative economic impact for those target populations of artists, artisans, and small business. Go to the next slide here. And we're good on time still. ARPA, the American Rescue Plan, is pretty clear on ineligible uses of funding. You can't use it to deposit into pension funds. You can't use it for debt servicing or replenishing, stabilization, or rainy day funds. And then other personal enrichment activities, that's just an umbrella term, meaning you can't use it on personal travel, personal items, or to pay off your own house or something. It has to be connected to the organization. The timeline for use of funds is similar to Jack's program. Funding can be used for costs incurred after March 3rd, 2021. All funds must be spent by December 31st, 2024, with receipts of those expenses provided no later than 2026. So there's a good runway of time to use these grant funds. Grant fund dispersal. Funds will be dispersed primarily by reimbursement. So you have to submit receipts or invoices for expenses before you'll get that funding. But we also know that a lot of nonprofits as businesses themselves, or those target populations, they might not have cash on hand or cash in their accounts to pay for expenses. So by case limited basis, we can do advance payment. So if that's something you'd be interested in, if you're awarded grant funds, you can contact our staff and get more information, and we can see if that's a possibility. But in the majority, the reimbursement is the main way we'll disperse grant funding. This next slide I'll have Kathy Rigby go over.
So everything for these ARPA grant funds is based on a narrative that we'll need to obtain from the businesses or the nonprofit. And it's tied to what the impact was to the organization, what the proposed use is of the eligible funds that you can spend, and then a sort of self-reporting afterwards how these funds impacted the recovery. And so what we're showing here is the place in the application where you'll indicate your impact. So this section of the application here on the left will show all of the ways that you could have been impacted by COVID-19 and the related shutdowns. And then on the right are the proposed budget, where we're going to ask you to sort of, if you're applying for $50,000, how do you intend to split up the $50,000 among the eligible use categories you see there on the right. And so what we're asking is for all applicants to do their best to make that impact statement related to the proposed budget. That will help us in making sure that you're tying that narrative to how you intend to use these budgets. So for example, if your narrative says that you were impacted by COVID and you fell behind by 10 months on paying your rent in your location, then the options you have on the right as a proposed recovery would be the mortgage or rent assistance. But if instead your statement said that you were impacted by COVID with revenue loss overall, and your business was unable to make payroll, you were unable to pay your rent or utility costs on time, you were unable to order all of the supplies needed to continue your business, then on the right, you would have things like payroll, you would have costs to retain employees possibly, you could use the funding to pay more the mortgage and rent, and you could also use it for other operating costs or supplies to continue doing business. So as much as possible, we need to make sure that your impact statement, and that is a narrative we're including in the application, is tied to how you intend to recover from that impact with the budget dollars.
All right, now we'll go a little bit more in detail about subrecipient programming, the grant funding tied to that. So as I said before, the intention of these funds is to provide an effective and efficient program designed to respond to negative economic impacts for artists, artisans, and small businesses of less than 50 full-time employees. This is a little bit of a look of kind of what we'll be looking for in the application. A clear causal relationship tying the recovery to impact, a concise scope of work, the goals, reporting framework, and deliverables of a proposed program. Outline if your funding supports a new program or an existing program with an increased level of service. The marketing and outreach efforts to get to that target population and support them. The amount of program staff to run successfully and their experience, on running and administration of a program. There'll be a budget of revenues and expenses. And one also important thing is describing how your system ensures isolation of these requested funds from other agency funds, because these are federal ARPA dollars. They're pretty stringent, that these need to be separated and these funds need to be specifically used for these purposes. So, we'll just ask in the application that you give details of that and make sure that there's systems in place to ensure that. Deadlines and how to apply is a lot of it's very similar to Jack's program. The application portal will open for a 30-day window from September 1st to September 30th. And applications received after that will not be accepted. Our side of the program, we are going to offer a second phase of funding, most likely 2 or 3 months after, this September timeframe. It'll be similar. We're a 30-day window, and we're doing this a second phase to really allow for equitable access. If there's, organizations that just need longer lead times to get through documents and to get through the application, if they need to have assistance with us or language assistance, or if they were unsuccessful in the first round, they can make improvements in the application and apply again. So we'll release more information on the second phase in the coming months, after we get through this first phase. How to apply, specifically and preferably online, starting September 1st, applicants can visit the portal. There's a link there to the SLC ED website, where the application portal will open on September 1st. For the mail and in-person, this will be specifically for small business applicants. So if you're a nonprofit applying for subrecipient funding, we'd ask you to go online. There won't be a mail or in-person option. But if you're applying, for yourself and for your nonprofit, you can also do mail. There's the address there. Pick up a paper application and drop it back off to us in person. How will our applications be evaluated? Once submitted, we'll review the application for compliance. We'll reach out to you if there's any missing information or we need additional information to help in the scoring and review. And then, applications will be reviewed in open and public meetings by the Community Recovery Committee. So this is a new committee created by City Council in order to run this program, both on Jack's side and our side. This will be 7 to 9 members who come from other city boards and committees. And they'll have 30 days after the portal closes to review and also score applications, considering all the requirements and, geographic equity. After the committee does their scoring, they'll make funding recommendations to the mayor and city council. The mayor and city council will make the final funding decisions. So it'll go through those several steps and phases. And then after that first, phase is done, we'll get to the second stage in the coming months. So required documents for specifically the small business applicants. So the federal income tax returns pre and post pandemic, this will be the way that you can demonstrate your negative impact through COVID. Let's say if you submit your 2019 tax return with a specific revenue and your 2021 has, $50,000 less, you can say I've been impacted $50,000. A signed copy of your W-9, current copy of your Salt Lake City business license, and a photo ID. That could be driver's license, passport, birth certificate, or another type of ID card. Those are the four main ones. Depending on how you want to use the funding, there will also be possible other required documents that are talked about. I won't go through now, but when we send out the presentation, you can look through that as well. Required documents for subrecipient applicants. The federal income tax return, your proof of 501c status, articles of incorporation, and similar to Jack's, the proof of compliance with workers' comp and proof of liability insurance. So to end here, we also want to give as much help and assistance as possible. For Kathy and I, this is basically all we do. This is our job. And so we're really here to get this funding out, but also to help as many people as possible. We're doing webinars like this, today, but we'll also keep you updated if there's upcoming trainings where you can ask questions, one-on-one appointments you can schedule with us. These can be in English and Spanish. Kathy, speaks Spanish. We can also give assistance in multiple languages as well, working with the mayor's office if you need help in languages other than English or Spanish. We've also partnered with a couple different community partners, the Utah Small Business Development Center. They're available to help with people with applications, with questions. All you'd have to do is basically register with their office, which is a pretty simple process. The Sorensen Unity Center Computer Lab on the west side is open for computer availability. They won't specifically have, ARPA experts there, but they can definitely help you to access the application, get online if you need help with that. Also ADA accessibility through the Salt Lake City Mayor's office. You can contact Ashley. She's the ADA coordinator, and her contact information is there if you need reasonable accommodations with the application. I will note that taking advantage of these help and assistance options can help you in the scoring process. We're giving basically 10 additional bonus points for people that have gotten assistance, because we want these applications to be, high quality. We want people to, get the help that they need. So I would highly encourage you to take one of these options. And as always, we have our contact info there, and Kathy can help in Spanish as well if needed. So that's the presentation. I don't know if we want to go back to and see if there's any questions on either program.
Thank you so much. We did have a couple of questions in the chat. First one is from Sasha. Let's see. As a nonprofit, we do not have an owner. Can we still utilize the woman or minority ownership clause, referring to our chief executive director?
That's a great question. We hadn't contemplated that somebody wouldn't be listed. So if someone's listed on the board or in a level of authority that organizes, we can look at what your who and what your organization serves, and sort of make that determination. My guess is that you would be applying as an individual business to that designation as disproportionately impacted gets you eligible uses, additional eligible uses. So that may or may not serve you, but we can certainly look at, if you're an approved grantee, we can look at and seeing if those additional eligible uses are something that benefit your organization.
Okay. Sasha, did that answer your question, or do you have any follow-up questions with that?
No, that answered my question. Thank you.
Okay.
And then Will asked, is there a different financial management approach for nonprofits in the sub-grant category? E.g., if a nonprofit is selected for up to 100,000, are you assuming they provide direct financial assistance to artists, etc., and then be reimbursed? Or is there a different system in place for pass-through funds? And Will, I
So-
don't know if you want to go off mute and clarify that question if I asked that correctly or not. Sorry, go ahead, Kathy.
I was going to say, if I'm understanding the question, the payment process that the organization would go through is the reimbursement. That is generally our operating procedure. So an organization would provide an invoice or a receipt to be reimbursed those funds. Jack's group is also offering on a limited basis, as are we, advanced funding, and this is for smaller nonprofits or smaller businesses. If there's a particular situation where the funding isn't available to actually offer the service, then we can consider that, and then we would get all the details surrounding why that would be. Our department is going to allow up to 50% of the funding to be available this way, but with strict requirements that invoicing and receipts be provided within 45 days. So we're not allowing the wait period to go for the full length of the grantee term. They would have to provide the invoice and receipts almost immediately after paying for that expense.
I'll just add to Kathy's comments there that while our program is also allowing for limited sort of upfront payment, most of it is going to be reimbursement based, particularly because we are going to have reporting requirements and outcomes and outputs that we'll need to be measuring. And if we're covering too many costs upfront, we may not be confident that we might be able to receive those output numbers before. So by and large, this is going to be, like Kathy said, much better than me, reimbursement based, covering costs after your organization has already incurred them.
Thank you. Looks like Caitlin had a question. Can a nonprofit apply for both these opportunities, or are they mutually exclusive?
So we love that question because a nonprofit entity can actually apply now in 3 ways, right? So through Jack's, if you happen to be a nonprofit that provides that type of service in one of Jack's priority areas for his department, as a small business in our department, just for your organization and to recover maybe your loss of revenue from fees or whatever the impact was at COVID for your personal nonprofit. Or again, if you also offer programming that serves the small business or arts community, that would be another option. So where they're not mutually exclusive, you may receive awards in all 3 of those categories. You may receive awards in none of those categories. So you're welcome to apply for all that apply to you.
Yeah, please do. One thing I'll add is the more grants you apply for, it is possible because the committee might score or award slightly less funds to each one of your awards if you're applying for many. That depends entirely on your proposal. But it is something to consider. The more applications and programs you apply for, it's possible that scoring committee, which we are not on, might score them differently or might award slightly less than you're requested because of that. But Kathy's right. You can apply for hers. You can apply for Department of Economic Development. You can apply for ours. I think there's something that's going to be on both of our applications for you to notify us if you are applying for the others' applications, just so that we can ensure that there's no confusion.
I will add just one more comment on this issue. And there is language in the ARPA regulations that say you cannot recover beyond what you've been impacted. So just keep that in mind for a nonprofit organization as a small business. This doesn't apply as a subrecipient, obviously, because you're passing through the funding to other organizations. You yourself don't have to meet the requirements of being impacted by COVID-19, but just as a small business, you're looking to show us how much you've been impacted as a dollar amount, and the recovery can't exceed that. Now we can reduce that amount, unfortunately, because the demand might be great and the committee might score things based on a number of reasons, and they might say, okay, we understand you were impacted, to the tune of $100,000, but all we can award you is, 25, let's say. That is within their purview to award as they see fit. They will make that recommendation to the mayor's office, and ultimately the mayor and city council will decide the final awards.
Thank you. Okay. And just to clarify, Kathy and Todd, your program is only available to Salt Lake City organizations. It doesn't go out to Salt Lake County, correct?
Correct. Only metropolitan Salt Lake City boundaries.
Some clarification though on mine, and I imagine on Kathy's too. Your organization doesn't need to be based in Salt Lake City. It just needs to be serving people in Salt Lake City. So if you have a location that is in the county or even outside of the county, but you're serving individuals within the municipal boundaries, you're more than welcome to apply.
That's helpful. Okay.
Yeah, and that's on the subrecipient relationship. So just, we got to keep the two groups separately. So if you're applying as a nonprofit business for your own funding, just as a small business, then you will be required to be located in Salt Lake City. But if you're outside of Salt Lake City boundaries and you have programming to help Salt Lake City, then that's not the requirement. I hope that's not confusing.
Yeah.
There is separate treatment of.
And you can, I would, if your specific organization has maybe a complex location or who they serve, just I would, highly recommend to reach out to us and, through email or just a phone call, and we can, if there's kind of complex questions on that, we can for sure help out.
Well, I think that's all the questions that were entered into the chat. Does anyone have any additional questions for our speakers today? Feel free to go off mute and ask, or you can type it in the chat. It looks like Todd's added his email and Kathy's email into the chat. And there's Jack. So if you guys would like to copy that and save that, those are in the chat for you. All right, I think I'll go ahead and stop our recording.